If you look at how finance is taught, I mean, in almost any top university, it's treated like a hard science.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about math, right? Formulas, economic models, these really complex calculations.
Exactly. And if that were actually predictive of success, you'd think every single Nobel laureate in economics, every quant with a genius-level IQ would just be wildly rich.
But we know that's not true, not even close. And that's really the core of what we're digging into today. Our sources reveal this profound and really essential truth
Which is?
that financial outcomes are less about how smart you are with a calculator and everything to do with psychology and behavior. Doing well with money is fundamentally a soft skill.
A soft skill, not hard science.
Yeah, it's about how you manage your emotions, your ego, your sense of time. It's about how you behave.
So our mission for this deep dive is to basically rip that old assumption apart. We're going to explore the behavioral lessons, the real psychology of money, to give you a kind of shortcut to financial wisdom.
And we're going to be focusing on why temperament just trumps genius every single time.
And you really don't have to look far for proof. Let's start with this incredible contrast between two men detailed in our source material. It's pretty shocking.
The first example is really a cautionary tale. It's about raw, unrestrained intelligence. This was a technology executive, someone who was, a certified genius.
He'd achieved incredible financial success based on that technical skill.
For a while, yes. But his behavior, it was just chaotic. The sources describe this one night. He was, I guess, drinking with friends, and he's standing on a dock overlooking the Pacific Ocean.
Then he starts taking handfuls of solid gold coins.
Right, not chocolate coins. We're talking actual gold.
And he's skipping them across the water like they're just rocks, just cackling as all this value vanishes into the ocean forever.
The sheer disregard for it. But it gets worse. He's at a high-end hotel in Los Angeles, and he accidentally shatters a lamp in the restaurant, a $500 lamp.
Okay, an expensive mistake, but you pay for it and move on.
Well, not him. The manager brings him the bill for the replacement, and the executive just flies into a rage. He pulls out this massive, intimidating brick of cash.
A brick of cash?
Thousands and thousands of dollars. And he peels off $5,000, hands it to the manager, and just snarls, "Never insult me like that again."
Wow. That is the absolute peak of hubris. A genius who just completely lost control of his ego and his emotions.
And the outcome was predictable, wasn't it? Despite his incredible intellect, his terrible behavior drove him into financial ruin just a few years later.
So his massive intelligence was, in the end, totally useless.
It was worse than useless. It was a liability because it fed his ego.
Okay, so now let's compare that story to the other man in our sources, Ronald James Reed.
Ronald Reed. He was a janitor and a gas station attendant, born in rural Vermont, first in his family to graduate high school.
So no formal financial education, no high-powered network.
And definitely no gold coins to skip across the water.
He lived a life of just deliberate simplicity. Fixed cars for 25 years, swept floors for another 17. He bought a modest two-bedroom house for $12,000 when he was 38 and lived there his whole life.
His main hobby, famously, was chopping firewood. Not exactly the typical path you'd imagine from massive wealth.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Yet when he died in 2014 at 92, he made international news.
Because his net worth was over $8 million.
$8 million. And to put that in perspective, our sources note that fewer than 4,000 Americans who died that year had a net worth that high. He was in a very, very elite group.
So how did he do it? It's almost boring in its simplicity, which is the whole point. He saved what little he could.
He invested those small savings patiently into blue-chip stocks.
And then, and this is the most crucial part, he just waited. For decades.
And those small, consistent savings just compounded and compounded, allowing him to leave millions to his local hospital and his local library.
And that contrast is really the perfect starting point for this deep dive. On one side, you have massive intelligence, but it's coupled with this destructive ego and impatience and leads to ruin.
And on the other, you have average intelligence, but it's coupled with extreme patience and frugality and leads to this massive, quiet success.
It's just undeniable proof that your financial outcomes are determined by the personality in the driver's seat.
And it's not an isolated case. The sources also detail the story of a Harvard-educated Merrill Lynch executive, Richard Fuscone.
Right. He retired in his 40s after a stellar career, but he borrowed heavily to expand this massive 18,000 square foot mansion.
Costing over $90,000 a month just to maintain.
So when the 2008 crisis hit, that high debt instantly bankrupted him. The mansion was sold in foreclosure. Fuscone was educated in global finance. Reed was educated in sweeping floors.
But Reed was patient and modest, and Fuscone was greedy and overleveraged. That behavioral gap was it was everything. It completely eclipsed the education gap.
It's the whole ballgame.
Okay, so if financial success really does hinge on psychology, let's start to unpack those skills. We can start with section 1, which is about the subjectivity of money, or, as the sources put it, why no one is crazy.
The core insight here is that every single person's financial decisions, from the most conservative saver to the most reckless trader, they're all anchored to their own unique lived experiences.
So experiences shaped by their generation, their income level, the specific economy they grew up in?
Exactly. Their values, their culture, and just sheer luck. So what looks completely irrational or, crazy to one person makes perfect sense to another.
Because they're using a different historical anchor point.
They are. And this is a huge point. Lived experience just has this emotional weight, this level of consequence that reading about something in a textbook just can't replicate.
And the sources use the Great Depression as a really powerful illustration of this, the scarring power of experience.
Absolutely. The writer Frederick Lewis Allen noted that the Depression literally marked millions of Americans for the rest of their lives. It instilled in them this deep, lasting paranoia about debt and risk.
But then you have someone like John F. Kennedy. When he was running for president, he was asked about his memories of the Depression.
And his reply is just stunning. He said he had no firsthand knowledge of the Depression.
No firsthand knowledge.
None. He said his family had one of the great fortunes of the world, and it was worth more than ever then. He said, we had bigger houses, more servants, we traveled more.
He actually said that the only direct experience he had was watching his father hire extra gardeners just to give them work so they could eat.
Kennedy didn't learn about the Depression until he read about it at Harvard. And that is the fundamental difference. You and I can read a detailed history of the 2008 collapse. We can model the financial impact on a spreadsheet.
But you can't model the feeling.
You cannot model the agony of coming home and looking at your children, knowing your investment mistakes might imperil their entire future. That emotional scar changes your behavior in a way that, financial literacy alone never, ever could.
And the scarring is so intensely generational, right? It just defines your tolerance for risk.
Totally. Take two people separated by just 20 years. If you were born around 1970, the S&P 500 increased almost tenfold, adjusted for inflation, during your most impressionable years, your teens and 20s.
So you grew up thinking stocks are this amazing wealth-generating machine. It's almost an entitlement. That's your operating system.
Right. But if you were born just 20 years earlier, say in 1950, the market went virtually nowhere in those exact same impressionable years, again, adjusted for inflation.
So your operating system tells you that stocks are a rigged game, a fool's errand.
Or at best, only for short-term speculation. And both people believe their calculation is the correct one because it's based on their lived reality.
We see the same thing with inflation and bonds, don't we?
We do. If you grew up in America during the 1960s and 70s, you saw staggering inflation. Prices for goods tripled. You remember gas lines and your parents complaining about shrinking purchasing power.
So you tend to view bonds, which lose value in high inflation, as wealth incinerators for the rest of your life. You're always trying to avoid that memory.
But someone born in 1990, they've experienced remarkably low and stable inflation their entire adult life. Their experience tells them bonds are safe, reliable anchors in a portfolio. They just lack that emotional anchor of economic trauma.
And this subjectivity, it extends globally, socioeconomically. It challenges our sort of Western middle-class assumptions about what rational behavior even is.
Yes, the sources use the really stark example of the Foxconn factory conditions, which were often criticized here in the West as just atrocious exploitation.
I remember reading a comment from a relative of a Chinese worker that just shed a completely different light on this.
Right. The worker's aunt had been working as a prostitute before she took the factory job. So the factory labor, even though it's hard and underpaid by our standards, it was a significant improvement for her.
It offered stability, safety, a degree of dignity she didn't have before.
So what looks like an unacceptable condition to us represents measurable, meaningful progress to someone else, all based on their starting point.
Which brings us back to maybe the most challenging example of seemingly irrational behavior, the lottery ticket buyer.
This one is so hard for financially savvy people to reconcile. The data shows that the lowest income households spend, on average, $412 a year on lottery tickets.
4 times the amount spent by the highest earners.
And these are often the same people who say they couldn't afford a $400 emergency expense. It just seems purely financially crazy.
It does if you assume the purchase is a financial investment.
But it's not. That's the key. If you're struggling to save, if the prospects for wage growth seem completely out of reach, and if all the financial models tell you that retiring with comfort is basically impossible,
Then buying that lottery ticket is the only time you get to hold a tangible dream in your hand.
you are paying for a brief, week-long sense of possibility, of dignity, of having a shot at the good stuff that wealthier people just take for granted.
So the $400 isn't the cost of a bad investment. It's the price of a fleeting psychological escape. It's an emotional payment.
It reframes the entire conversation. We don't have to agree with the decision, but we can understand the internal psychological logic. Few people make financial decisions with a cold spreadsheet. They make them at the dinner table, shaped by their ego, pride, and their unique history.
And we also have to recognize just how new our financial system is. We are all making these decisions based on really limited, unique historical data because the landscape changes so fast.
Oh, unbelievably fast. The very concept of a dignified retirement, the idea that you won't work until you physically die, is barely 2 generations old. Before World War II, working until you died was the norm.
And what about the backbone of modern American retirement savings? The 401k didn't even exist until 1978.
And the Roth IRA was born in 1998. These core tools are incredibly new. Then look at college education. The share of Americans with a bachelor's degree exploded from less than 1 in 20 in 1940 to 1 in 4 by 2015.
And that rapid explosion, plus tuition rising fourfold adjusted for inflation, meant millions of people were forced to make these complex, irreversible decisions about massive student debt.
With no accumulated historical experience to guide them, we are, all of us, essentially winging it.
So no one is crazy. We're all just reacting to our own history. Okay, so if we can accept that, let's explore the role of these huge external forces. Which brings us to Section 2, luck, risk, and the power of outliers.
Right. Luck and risk are siblings. They are these twin forces that govern outcomes, and they demonstrate that your results are dictated by factors well beyond your personal effort or skill.
They exist because you are just one person in a game with 7 billion others. And a million things are happening all around you that you can't possibly control.
And the ultimate illustration of this randomness is the story of Bill Gates and his best friend, Kent Evans.
Gates had this truly 1 in a million stroke of luck that just set his destiny.
Absolutely. In 1968, as a 13-year-old, he attended Lakeside School in Seattle. Lakeside was one of the only high schools in the entire world with a teletype computer terminal hooked up to a General Electric mainframe.
Most colleges didn't have that kind of access back then.
And his intellectual co-pilot, the person who was equally obsessed and ambitious, was Kent Evans. They were inseparable, scheming about being future CEOs, working all night on programming problems.
Gates himself said they would have stayed partners. Evans could easily have been a founding partner of Microsoft.
But Kent died in a mountaineering accident before graduation.
A 1 in a million risk.
The odds are roughly 1 in a million, yes. So you have Gates with 1 in a million luck that put him in front of that machine, and Evans with 1 in a million risk that took him away. You cannot believe in one without acknowledging the other.
That story really forces you to grapple with the difficulty of attribution. We love simple narratives. Success is skill and hard work. Our failure is bad luck. Other people's failure is because they made bad decisions.
But how much of Gates' success was skill, and how much was just? Kent Evans not being there, it creates a really flawed learning environment.
How so?
Well, the cover of Forbes magazine, it celebrates the rich. But these celebrated investors often got there because they were reckless and just got lucky.
Meanwhile, the investor who made a conservative, good decision but faced the unfortunate side of risk, like a sudden market crash, they're completely ignored.
This is why studying extreme success, billionaires, and the massive failures is actually dangerous. Their outcomes are, by definition, influenced by extreme luck or extreme risk.
Which makes their specific lessons the least applicable to the average person.
Right. We shouldn't try to replicate Buffett's returns because so much of his success is impossible to separate from the decades of uninterrupted compounding he was lucky enough to enjoy, starting at age 10.
So instead, we should focus on broad, repeatable patterns.
Exactly. Like the fact that people who have control over their time tend to be happier. That's an actionable, controllable takeaway. Replicating a 1950s market entrance is not.
And these random extreme outcomes are so critical because of what the sources call the tail event phenomenon.
Yes, the idea that a small number of events account for the overwhelming majority of all results. Tails drive everything.
So if you invest in stocks, you have to be comfortable with being wrong most of the time.
You do. Look at the art dealer, Heinz
Right.
Berggruen. He fled Nazi Germany and became this hugely successful art dealer.
And he didn't focus on picking individual masterpieces.
No, he operated like a massive index fund for art. He bought vast quantities of it, knowing that 99% would probably be worthless.
But the 1% that turned out to be early Picassos or Matisses, that would create his billion-dollar fortune.
He could be wrong most of the time and still end up stupendously right.
Walt Disney's early days were the same.
By the mid-1930s, Disney had produced over 400 cartoons. Most of them lost money or barely broke even.
But the 83 Minutes of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was the single tail event.
That one film, it earned $8 million in 6 months, paid off all the company's debts, and established the new studio. That one winner accounted for more returns than hundreds of losers combined.
And the data on the stock market is just brutal in supporting this. We hear about market averages, but if you look at the entire universe of U.S. stocks, the Russell 3000.
It is brutal. Since 1980, 40% of all stocks in that index have lost 70% or more of their value and never recovered. The majority of all market returns are driven by a handful of extraordinary winners.
Apple, Microsoft, Amazon.
Right, so if you hold an index fund, you're essentially paying for thousands of losers just so you can catch the handful of winners that actually matter.
So the relevance for you, the investor, is that being wrong half the time, or even more, is normal. Failure isn't a bad decision. It's just the cost of admission for being in the game.
And your success is determined by what you do during that small number of days, maybe 1% of the time, when everyone else around you is losing their mind.
The ability to do the average, boring thing, like just holding steady when chaos reigns.
Yeah.
That's the definition of genius in finance.
You have to internalize that lots of things going wrong isn't failure. It's the normal, messy path that makes the few winners stand out.
That's a huge mindset shift. Okay, so if the vast majority of assets are just noise and a few winners drive all the returns, how do we know when we've succeeded enough? That moves us to Section 3, the danger of never having enough.
This section starts with what I think is just the perfect definition of financial wisdom. It's an exchange between the writers Joseph Heller and Kurt Vonnegut at a billionaire's party.
Vonnegut points out that their hedge fund manager host made more money in a single day than Heller had earned from his classic novel Catch-22 over its entire history.
And Heller's reply is just. It's perfect. He says, yes, but I have something he will never have.
Enough.
Enough. That one simple word captures the single hardest financial skill to master, getting the goalpost to stop moving.
And modern capitalism is just incredible at generating not just wealth, but also envy and social comparison.
It's a machine for it. And we see the ruin of men who had immense wealth, but risk it all for just a little bit more. Rajai Gupta is the ultimate cautionary tale here.
An orphan teenager from India who rose to become the CEO of McKinsey. He retired with a net worth of $100 million.
I mean, by any objective measure, he had won the game. But he desperately wanted to be a billionaire. He needed to be in that absolute inner circle.
And that desperation, that lack of enough, drove his ruin.
He was on the Goldman Sachs board, and he learned in real time about Warren Buffett's $5 billion investment during the 2008 crisis. 16 seconds after hanging up the phone from that board meeting, he called his hedge fund manager friend, Raj Rajaratnam,
passing an insider tip that quickly made about $1 million in profit.
Just think about the psychology. He already had $100 million. He threw away his reputation, his freedom, his legitimate fortune, all in pursuit of a $1 million fraudulent gain. It was pure greed driven by social comparison. He couldn't stand the thought that his friend was making more.
We see the same paradox with Bernie Madoff. Before the Ponzi scheme, Madoff had a legitimate, wildly successful market-making business.
It was generating between $25 and $50 million a year for him. He was genuinely, legally wealthy. But he still risked everything because he just lacked that sense of enough.
This really illustrates the goalpost problem. When your ambition increases faster than your satisfaction, the goalpost just moves faster than you do.
You take one step forward, and society, or your peer group, pushes the goalpost 2 steps ahead. It forces you into greater and greater risk-taking just to feel like you're keeping up.
And social comparison is so toxic because the ceiling is infinitely high. The sources detail how a rookie baseball player making $500,000 a year feels poor next to Mike Trout's $36 million contract.
And Trout probably compares himself to a top hedge fund manager making $340 million, who then compares himself to Jeff Bezos, whose net worth can increase by $24 billion in a single year. You can never, ever win that race.
The only way to win is to choose not to play.
That's the wisdom of that Vegas dealer's insight. The only way to win in a Las Vegas casino is to exit as soon as you enter. If you keep playing the comparison game, you will eventually find yourself risking things you never intended to lose.
So defining enough is critical. And it's not about scarcity. It's about realizing that the opposite, this insatiable appetite, will inevitably push you to the point of regret.
It will. Why are we so reluctant to define a point of satisfaction in finance when we instinctively know when we've had enough to eat?
Because the consequences of overeating are immediate, whereas the consequences of financial overreaching can take decades to materialize.
And what you're risking for that marginal gain is invaluable. Your reputation, your freedom, your family. Gupta's post-prison takeaway, according to the sources, was just the worst possible takeaway. He regretted being attached to his reputation.
But his reputation, his freedom.
Yeah.
Those are the very things you should never risk for money, no matter the potential reward.
That sets us up perfectly for Section 4, the path to longevity, focusing on compounding and survival. If wealth is about the long game, how do we make sure we stay in it?
We have to start with compounding, which is, it's almost impossible for the human brain to grasp intuitively.
It really is. We think linearly. We could easily calculate 8 plus 8 plus 8, but compounding is exponential. 8 multiplied by itself 9 times results in over 134 million. That massive nonlinear jump just defies our common sense.
And this is why time is Warren Buffett's single greatest asset. His fortune isn't just because he's a good investor.
Lots of people are good investors.
Right. It's because he's been a good investor since he was 10 years old. The vast majority of his wealth came after he turned 60.
Yeah, consider the thought experiment. If Buffett earned his extraordinary 22% annual returns, but only started at age 30 and retired at 60, his net worth would be a tiny fraction of what it is today.
So time, not just skill, is the key driver of that outcome.
He became a billionaire because he started young and he survived.
We see this exponential curve in technology too, like with hard drive storage.
Great example. From 1950 to 1990, a 40-year period, storage capacity gained about 296 megabytes, a slow, steady climb. But from 1990 to 2019, capacity gained over 100 million megabytes.
That exponential explosion is so hard to anticipate. Even Bill Gates underestimated it, right?
Famously. He criticized Gmail's 1 gigabyte of storage in 2004 as being excessive because his brain was still anchored in that linear paradigm of storage conservation.
So good investing is about earning pretty good returns that you can just stick with for the longest possible period of time.
It's so counterintuitive that the most powerful book about finance should probably be titled, Shut Up, and Wait, and just feature a long-term chart of economic growth.
But to stick with it, you need to master the art of survival.
This brings us to a critical distinction. Getting money versus staying wealthy. Getting money requires optimism, taking risks, pushing limits.
Staying wealthy requires the exact opposite temperament.
It requires frugality, humility, and a healthy dose of paranoia. Survival. You have to recognize that your past success was partly luck, and you can't rely on it to repeat itself.
We see the tragedy of this survival failure in the stories of two speculators from 1929, Jesse Livermore and Abraham Dramansky.
Livermore famously made the equivalent of over $3 billion by shorting the market during the crash. He became a legend. Dramansky, a multi-millionaire real estate developer, bet heavily on the market and was completely ruined.
He was last seen just scattering torn ticker tape on Wall Street before he disappeared forever.
A tragic story. But Livermore's tragedy is that his massive success led to overconfidence. He made larger and larger bets after 1929, lost everything, and eventually took his own life.
So both men were excellent at getting wealthy.
And both were equally bad at staying wealthy. They lacked the survival skills, the humility to stop betting big, and the paranoia to protect what they had.
Longevity, not just brilliance, makes the difference.
It does. Michael Moritz of Sequoia Capital was asked why his firm had prospered for 4 decades. He said their success came from always being afraid of going out of business. They maintained that paranoid survival mindset even during the good times.
And this ties right back to Buffett. His success is defined by what he didn't do.
He didn't use debt. He didn't panic and sell during the 14 recessions he lived through. He didn't burn out. He just survived long enough for compounding to work its magic.
So the ultimate application of this survival mindset is prioritizing being financially unbreakable over chasing bigger returns.
Which means having cash, even when inflation is eating away at it.
Holding cash when stocks are earning 10% feels like a failure. It feels conservative.
But that cash serves a huge, often invisible purpose. Its actual return is way higher than 1% if it prevents you from having to sell your stocks during a bear market.
Preventing one desperate, ill-timed sale at the bottom can do more for your lifetime returns than picking dozens of winners.
Compounding requires uninterrupted time, and survival, backed by cash, ensures that time continues.
Okay, so if the whole point of survival and longevity is compounding, we need to know what we're ultimately compounding towards. Which brings us to Section 5, the highest dividend, which is control over time.
Money's greatest intrinsic value, the ultimate return it pays, is the ability to buy control over your own time.
The psychologist Angus Campbell's research on happiness found that having a strong sense of control over your life is a more dependable predictor of well-being than your salary, the size of your house, or how prestigious your job is.
That's fascinating, isn't it? It's not about luxury goods. It's about the luxury of flexibility. And money buys this on a kind of escalator of independence.
What do you mean by an escalator?
Well, a small amount of savings means you can take a few sick days without financial stress. A bit more means you can wait for a truly good job after a layoff instead of grabbing the first one out of panic.
6 months of emergency funds means you aren't terrified of your boss. You can actually say no without fear.
And even more means you can take a lower-paying job that has better hours or a shorter commute. Or you can retire when you want to, not when you absolutely have to. Using money to buy time provides a lifestyle benefit that very few expensive things can match.
I actually experienced the opposite of that freedom early in my career. I was lured into an investment bank internship because of the huge potential salary. I believed that money was the key to happiness.
And what was the reality?
The reality was brutal hours. Going home before midnight was a luxury. The office mantra was basically, if you don't come to work on Saturday, don't bother coming back on Sunday.
You had the promise of money, but zero control.
None. The job was intellectually interesting, but every second of my time was a slave to my boss's demands. And that perfectly illustrates that reactance phenomenon.
The psychological need for autonomy.
Right. Doing something you might otherwise enjoy, but on a rigid schedule you can't control, feels exactly the same as doing something you hate. That control matters more than the paycheck.
How long did you last?
I lasted 1 month of a 4-month internship. That job was just disempowering. Derek Sievers, the entrepreneur, articulated a similar insight. His friend thought he got rich when he sold his company for millions.
But Seaver said the real difference happened much, much earlier.
When was that?
It was when he saved $12,000 in his early 20s. That small amount gave him the confidence and the financial runway to quit his day job and become a full-time musician.
That money bought him independence long before the big sale. That was true wealth.
Exactly. Which means we have to clearly differentiate between being rich and being wealthy.
Rich is high current income. It's visible. You see someone driving a $100,000 car, they're rich.
But the only thing you know for sure about their financial status is that they now have $100,000 less money or more debt than they did before.
Right. Wealth, on the other hand, is hidden. It's the income you don't spend. It's the unspent assets that provide flexibility, options, and growth.
And this hidden nature leads to a paradox. People often want wealth to signal respect and admiration. But when you see a fancy car, you rarely admire the driver.
You admire the car, and you imagine yourself in it.
You're not buying respect, you're creating envy. If respect is your goal, humility, kindness, and empathy will get you more of it than horsepower ever will.
So the real focus should be on building that hidden wealth, which means focusing relentlessly on your savings rate.
The savings rate is the key lever that is completely within your control, unlike your income or investment returns, which are governed by luck and risk.
And building wealth is driven primarily by that rate, which is just the leftovers after you spend what you take in. And the most effective way to increase savings isn't necessarily a higher income.
It's lowering your expenses, which requires desiring less.
Which in turn requires humility.
It does. Saving is the gap between your ego and your income. When you define it that way, you see why so many high-income earners save so little. They're locked in a struggle to spend money to show other people they have money.
Whereas people who build enduring wealth tend to simply not care what others think about their car or their house.
And the beauty of this is that you don't even need a specific goal for your savings. Unearmarked savings, saved just for the sake of flexibility, is a hedge against life's inevitable surprises.
That is the highest return on cash imaginable.
It is. Saving without a goal gives you the ability to wait for no-brainer opportunities. The control gained from unearmarked savings is an incalculable return. And because we can't easily measure it, we often overlook it.
Now that we've established survival and time as the anchors, let's move to Section 6, which helps us manage those anchors in the real world, planning for reality or aiming to be reasonable instead of rational.
This is so important. You are not a perfect cold spreadsheet. You're an emotional human being. The moment you aim to be coldly rational with your money, you're setting yourself up for a strategy you just can't stick with.
So we should aim for a pretty reasonable strategy instead, one that maximizes our long-term endurance.
Exactly. The fever analogy from the sources is the perfect illustration of this gap.
Right. Rational science shows that fevers help the body fight infection. A 1-degree increase in temperature can slow some viruses by a factor of 200.
Rationally, you should just endure the fever. Yet, universally, what do? We fight fevers with drugs. Why? Because fevers hurt.
A doctor's goal isn't just to cure the disease in the most efficient way, but to cure it within the confines of what's tolerable to the patient.
And investors should do the same. Don't chase the mathematically optimal strategy. Chase the strategy that maximizes how well you sleep at night. That is the reasonable approach.
Harry Markowitz, the Nobel Prize winner who literally pioneered modern portfolio theory, confessed that when he invested his own retirement money,
He split it 50-50 between bonds and equities. Not because it was the most rational strategy, but to minimize future regret.
he wanted to grieve less if the market soared without him, and also grieve less if the market crashed with him fully invested.
That is a fundamentally reasonable psychological choice, not a purely rational one.
Yeah?
Contrast that with the absurdly rational plan some academics promote.
That young savers should use 2-to-1 leverage on stocks.
Yes, the math shows higher expected long-term wealth, even if they get completely wiped out when they're young, as long as they just pick themselves up and keep going.
That sounds great on a spreadsheet, but it's just absurdly unreasonable in reality.
It is. No normal human could watch 100% of their retirement evaporate and then just say, well, the math says I must try again with 2.1 leverage. They'd quit. They'd suffer debilitating stress. The rational goal has to bend to human reality.
This is why room for error is the essential defense mechanism. It trumps almost every other financial principle.
Think of a successful card counter at a blackjack table. They know the odds are slightly in their favor, but they never bet everything they have. They bet less than they could to ensure they have enough money to withstand the inevitable bad swings and just keep playing.
Room for error isn't conservative, it's aggressive longevity.
It's necessary because the world is too complex to allow 100% of your actions to dictate 100% of your outcomes. We have to protect ourselves against the risks we can't even imagine.
Like the story from the Battle of Stalingrad, where German field mice ate the wiring of some of their reserve tanks.
A risk no tank designer would ever plan for, yet it critically undermined their capacity. You can't plan for the unthinkable, but you can build systems that can withstand it.
And the primary defense is avoiding single points of failure. The biggest financial one being sole reliance on a paycheck with no savings buffer.
We see this paranoia, this focus on unbreakability, in the greatest success stories. Bill Gates required Microsoft to always have enough cash to cover a year of payroll, even with zero revenue.
And Warren Buffett famously says he won't trade even a night's sleep for the chance of extra profits. That financial unbreakability is what allows compounding to continue for decades.
You have to be risk-loving enough to invest for growth, but completely averse to ruin.
We've established that our financial decisions are based on our unique history, and the future is ruled by these random tail events. This raises a big challenge. How do we use history as a guide without letting it become a trap? This brings us to Section 7, History as a Guide and the Danger of Changing Goals.
The great irony of finance is that history is the study of surprises. Things that have never happened before happen all the time. Yet investors use past data as this unassailable guide for the future. We fall into the historians as prophets fallacy.
If you rely strictly on history, you miss the outlier events that matter most. World War II, 9/11, the invention of the internet.
The fall of the Soviet Union. A handful of people or a few singular events are responsible for the majority of the world's direction. And those events have complex, unforeseen consequences.
It's hard to intuitively link 19 hijackers on 9/11 to the student loan debt crisis.
But the chain of cause and effect is real. The post-9/11 rate cuts fueled the housing bubble, which led to the crisis, which pushed millions to seek a college education, which resulted in the debt crisis. History is a trail of complex surprises.
We fall into the Pharaonic Nile paradox. Ancient Egyptian scribes tracked the high water mark of the Nile to predict the worst-case scenario for floods.
Right. And similarly, when engineers built the Fukushima nuclear reactor, they built it to withstand the worst historical earthquake and tsunami on record.
But the next worst event is, by definition, unprecedented.
They failed to imagine the unimaginable. That's not a failure analysis, it's a failure of imagination. We should use past surprises as a humbling admission that we need more room for error.
And if the external world is constantly surprising us, we are also constantly surprising ourselves. We suffer from the end of history illusion.
This is our innate tendency to underestimate how much our personalities, our desires, our goals will change in the future. We make these profound, long-term financial plans based on the goals of our current self.
Only to become a different person 5 or 10 years later who's now stuck with those past decisions.
Exactly. Think of the person who works tirelessly to become a doctor, only to call it an awful career 15 years later because the stress prevents them from seeing their family.
Or the teenager who dreams of being a lawyer, finds the hours too long, quits to be a stay-at-home parent, and is suddenly unprepared for retirement because all their planning was based on too high incomes.
Long-term financial planning is crucial, but how can you never interrupt compounding unnecessarily when your goals change so radically? This is why flexibility and unearmarked savings are so important.
We have to embrace the idea of abandoning financial goals set by a past different self when they no longer work. The source is, quote, Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate who would sometimes scrap months of work and start over, saying,
I have no sunk costs.
Sunk costs, the money or effort we've already spent, can anchor us to decisions that are bad for our future selves.
If you've invested $100,000 in a failing business, the rational choice is to quit. But the human tendency is to keep throwing good money after bad. Embracing change and moving on without mercy is often the best strategy.
Finally, let's talk about the essential price of success and the problem of playing different games. Section 8.
Everything valuable has a price, but the price of successful investing is rarely paid in dollars. The currency you pay is volatility, fear, doubt, uncertainty, and regret.
All invisible until you're experiencing them in real time when the market is crashing.
The S&P 500 returned 119-fold over 50 years. That sounds simple, right? Just hold stocks and get rich.
But the price of that success required enduring periods where the market was down 5% over 100 times and lost a third of its value at least 12 times.
Most people try to avoid paying that emotional price. They trade in and out, they look for tactical funds, they seek the reward without the risk. But the money gods do not look highly upon those who try to do that.
The attempt to avoid volatility usually ends up costing investors double in missed returns.
The classic example is GE under Jack Welch. He was lauded for decades because he smoothed quarterly earnings. He shielded shareholders from volatility by massaging the numbers.
He created the illusion of predictability. But the bill always comes due. That manipulation came at the cost of a decade of mammoth losses later on. You can only defer the emotional price for so long.
The crucial psychological shift here is viewing market volatility not as a fine or penalty for doing something wrong, but as a fee.
A necessary cost of admission, like the ticket price to Disneyland.
If you view the inevitable market decline as a fee, you pay it and you stick around long enough for compounding to work. If you see it as a fine, you immediately try to make decisions to avoid future penalties, and you end up selling at the worst possible time.
And this leads directly to the bubble problem, which is often caused by long-term investors taking cues from short-term traders playing an entirely different game.
We assume assets have one rational price, but that's nonsense when investors have wildly different goals and time horizons. Take Yahoo stock in 1999.
A day trader could rationally pay a ridiculous valuation because they only needed the stock to move up for a day or a month to make a profit.
They weren't analyzing discounted cash flows over 30 years. The collision happens when the long-term, value-oriented investor sees that momentum and gets persuaded to chase the price.
Not realizing they're now playing the short-term game without the right mindset or risk appetite.
And when the short-term players exit, the long-term investor is left holding the bag at an absurd valuation.
So the actionable takeaway here is critical. You must go out of your way to define what game you are playing.
Write down your personal investment mission statement. Something like, I am a passive investor who is optimistic in the world's ability to generate real economic growth And I'm confident that over the next 30 years, that growth will accrue to my investments.
And once that mission is established, you realize that everything unrelated, like what the market did this month or whether a recession is coming next year, is part of a game you are not playing, and you won't be persuaded by it.
And that leads us to our final synthesis. We can't offer a prescription because we don't know you or your unique history. Like a doctor who shifts from treating the disease to treating the patient, we can just share universal truths that you can apply reasonably to your own life.
So here are the key principles to follow, distilled from this deep dive. First, find humility when things are going right, and forgiveness when they go wrong. It's never as good or as bad as it looks.
Second, less ego, more wealth. Wealth is the gap between your ego and your income. Suppressing what you could buy today is the only way to have flexibility tomorrow.
Third, manage your money in a way that helps you sleep soundly at night. That is the best universal guidepost, trumping mathematical optimization every single time.
Fourth, if you want to do better, increase your time horizon. Time is the most powerful force in investing. It pushes results closer to what people deserve.
Fifth, be okay with a lot of things going wrong. It's normal. Measure success by your full portfolio, not by individual stocks or decisions.
Sixth, use money to gain control over your time. That ability to do what you want, when you want, pays the highest dividend that exists in finance.
Seventh, worship room for error. Endurance is what makes compounding magic. Avoid single points of failure and never take a risk that can wipe you out no matter the odds.
And finally, eighth, define and pay the price. View market volatility, doubt, and uncertainty as the necessary fee for admission, not a fine for doing something wrong.
That is the core of behavioral finance. But let's close on one final provocative thought for you to chew on, something that really connects all these points back to the world we live in.
Focus on the incredible power of stories and narratives. If you imagine an alien observer flying over the world in 2007 and then returning in 2009, they would have seen the same factories, the same roads, the same knowledge, the same tools.
But in 2009, the global economy was in ruins. Why? Because the only thing that had fundamentally changed was the story we told ourselves.
In 2007, we believed in the stability of housing, the prudence of bankers, and the unstoppable power of financial innovation. In 2009, we realized that narrative was a fiction, and we stopped believing it.
Stories are, by far, the most powerful force in the economy. They are the fuel or the brake.
And your personal financial success depends entirely on the story you tell yourself about your own patience, your ego, and your need for control, and how effectively you guard against those appealing financial fictions that promise reward without requiring you to pay the price. No one is crazy, but we all live in a world governed by constantly changing narratives that dictate our fears and our fortunes.